program for the Emeriti Association, the Retirees Association, and the ERRC, all of our sponsors. So we're very glad to see you here. People beginning to get back together for in-person type meetings. I'm told this is about the second such meeting that we have had. Okay, so I'm the MC, and our guest speaker today is Ed Leamer, one of my most distinguished colleagues at the Anderson School. And I'm going to call him up, and I'm just, for the moment, just going to sit a little bit out of the way. And rather than just sort of read you his CV, and I think you probably got some version of that in the announcement of the program, I'm going to ask him some questions about it. And so he'll kind of introduce himself. So Ed, why don't you come up to the mic here? I'm going to sit over in the corner here, and we'll do some questions.
Are you in charge of turning that on?
Yeah. Oops. We have a real high-tech way of dealing with this. Okay, so I'm going to take the official CV here, and I'm not going to go in the order.
Feedback.
Working on it.
Michael, can we cut back the feedback, or are we doing something wrong? So I want to start, Ed, on your CV, your official CV, you never say anything about I was born in, I was raised at, any of that. So you want to tell us where you started life, and then we'll get into your more academic situations.
I was born in Prof, Wisconsin in May of 1944, when my father was preparing for the Battle of the Bulge.
Aha.
My mother was living with his father there in La Crosse.
Okay, and now I know you went to Princeton as an undergraduate.
I did.
Did you have any inkling before you got to Princeton about a career in economics? Did you know much about economics?
Well, my father was an economics faculty member at the University of Chicago, and then he went to the Harper College that became the State University of New York. But I had no intention of becoming an economist when I went to Princeton. And at that time, we were all worried about the Russians and Sputnik, and they were going to take over the country. And physics was the most important field to go into. So I was in that field for about 2 years.
So it says on your resume that you were a math major.
Correct.
Did you take any courses in economics, or did it interest you at that point?
Well, first, my story in physics is I had, as a freshman, was basically a mathematical course on physics. And then the second year, there were these labs that you sit in. I remember the Michelson-Morley oil drop experiment, where you had to balance a charged oil drop between two ledges, and I peered in hour after hour, and the friend who was my lab partner couldn't see that well, so I had to do all the work. I said, this is not for me. I didn't want to become a physicist and steer in and start looking. And I said, I'll do math. I enjoyed the physics math, and I was doing math. And then as I was ongoing, I took a couple courses in economics, which are kind of low-level math.
So that's where your interest developed. So I know you went to Michigan for your PhD, and there was an economics, so how did you make that transition?
Well, Harvard rejected me at that time. Well, later on I taught at Harvard, so I don't know what that even, but so to continue, the math has extraordinarily thin tail of individuals who are mathematicians. And they're the ones who are really making the contributions. And I was a little too far inside that distribution in order to be confident that I would have this extraordinary career. So economics was kind of low-level mathematics. I would be in the tail of that very easily. So I decided to apply to schools in economics. But when I went to Michigan, I did a master's in math as well as a PhD in economics.
And for the benefit of our audience, Ed is particularly known for econometrics and his econometric skills. So could you tell us where econometrics fits into the world of economics? Is it different than just statistics? What is econometrics?
So when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, they had it's a 3-story building, used to be a stable. And down in the basement is where they built the forecast. And up on the 3rd floor is where the econometricians talked about the theory of econometrics, how to carry out data analysis. And we're very careful about sins you will never commit. And the same faculty members who were telling us never to commit sins would go down below and build a model for forecasting, and it was totally sinful. So I thought there had to be some kind of process to bring these two things together. And I studied in the math department what's called Bayesian statistics. And the essential aspect of Bayesian as opposed to frequentist. Frequentist just relies on the data, but for Bayesian, the context matters. And the interpretation depends upon what you bring to the setting rather than just the data. So I was trying to recognize that those guys in the top floor were pretending that the context didn't matter when they were teaching us econometrics. And down at the bottom, they weren't being real Bayesians, but they were trying to use their personal understanding to create knowledge about how the economy operates.
And I think I'm sure you're going to get to this as you go through your presentation, but I know that you've written some books and articles and so on in which you try to sort of convey the sort of notion of a balanced methodology in economics. Why don't you say a little bit more about that?
Well, when I started my career, the thing that I worried most about is my ideas would be stolen. But I realized what's really important is being ignored altogether. So these classic books and papers that we talked about, I think they have incredibly important ideas about how economists should analyze data sets with humility, understanding that you're not running experiments. It isn't science. We call it social science, but it isn't science. Science requires randomized controlled trials. Economics is trying to draw conclusions from non-experimental data. And I have lots of ideas about how that ought to be done. And a warning is AI is doing what was being done in the basement long ago. And it's done without context, without the understanding. So if you ask me, the critical thing about AI, the critical thing that's needed is an interview. The computer should interview the analyst to find out what the context is and what kinds of additional information ought to be added to facilitate the interpretation of that data set. And that just isn't done.
I want to take you from Michigan. I know you mentioned that you taught at Harvard for a while. Then you came to UCLA and you were in the econ department.
Correct. And
at some point you flipped from the econ department to the management school. So what was all that
I
about?
don't know if I want to talk about that.
Well, you're the speaker, so you get to choose.
So math has been divided between, and linguistically, between those who speak only math and think only math is clear and can tell the truth, and the more traditional economics, which is verbal, like Keynes and Hayek, etc. And it was Samuelson who really introduced mathematics into the economics curriculum. And my view was that theory isn't by itself, that the theory being taught in the econ department at UCLA should prepare the students to do the applied work. Applied fields are labor economics, industrial organization, international economics, and what we need to do is facilitate the understanding analysis by the people in those applied fields with the assistance of the theorists. And the theorists came rushing into my office and smashing things and said, we are kings. We don't do what other people want us to do. We are pursuing the truth with our theoretical structures. So Sebastian Edwards and I seized on the opportunity to move to the business school to escape that. But we had new problems when we got there. That's all I'm going to say, though.
Okay. We won't ask for confidential disclosure. We know, of course, that you, for a time, time were director of the forecast and are still connected with the forecast. But I want to mention two other organizations and just have that you define them for us that are on your CV in which you have some affiliation or role. One is the National Bureau of Economic Research. Would you say a little bit more about that? I'm sure it's going to come up particularly when we talk about recessions and those sorts of things, but just define that for our audience.
Well, it's a group of economists. You know, almost all the high-quality schools will have all their economists who are officially part of the National Bureau of Economic Research. It didn't start that way. It's a much smaller organization, but it's expanded enormously. And what you made a reference to, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, is there's a committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research that decides when the recession begins and when it ends. And they're in complete control over that category.
And this is, to make it clear, this is a private organization. It's not, it sounds like a government agency, National Bureau,
Yeah, it's private.
but it is, in fact, a private, nonprofit organization. Now, the other organization that you mentioned in your CV is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So say a little bit about what that does and what its importance is.
Well, it's not just a big day. I've been involved with many of those government agencies. I've worked with the National Science Foundation, with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the BEAs, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I served on a committee that was recommending and overseeing. I've had a long-time relationship with Washington.
And the BEA, where you hear words like gross domestic product and so on, or balance of trade, or some of these things, a lot of that comes from this is a government agency, and it produces these statistical things that economists are fond, particularly those in the forecasting field, are fond of talking
GDP
about.
comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but the labor data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Right. So I think we haven't covered everything in the resume by any means. You did mention one thing that I think would catch people's eye, and that is you were a vice presidential candidate in a recent election. You want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was studying back on the East Coast at Boston University. Larry Kotlikoff, he was here for a while too. And so he called me up one afternoon in June and said he was going to run for the presidency, and he had done that before. There was an attempt at an internet-based nominations that never turned out, but he had tried to go down that route. But this time he was going to, go to all the states and try to get on the ballots. And I said, that's great. I'll vote for you for sure. And he said, well, that's good, but I'd like you to be my vice president. So I said, sure. And when I went home, I told my wife this, and she said, don't tell anybody.
Well, if you put it on your CV, you can't hide it.
That's true.
Okay, and I would say you got as many electoral votes as Ross Perot.
I didn't know that.
Okay, so I'm going to take my hat off the projector here, and the first segment of this program is going to be dealing with the kinds of things that the forecast talks about, and then we're going to take some questions, Q&A. Ed is very anxious to have questions come from the audience. I think we have a microphone set up. It may be hard for everybody to get over there. So if you do ask a question in the Q&A period, I'll try to repeat it so that it gets recorded for posterity. So Ed, why don't you take over?
Okay, great.
And we'll start our presentation with the first segment.
So one thing I'd like to talk about is education. I say education is conversation. So we don't want a classroom to be a Xerox machine where the students just write down what I say, and then I test them at the end to see how accurate the recording is. It's a conversation where both the faculty member and the students are creating ideas and thoughts. And one problem with the campus today is there's hardly anybody around. It's kind of hard to have a conversation anymore. Residue of COVID. And I really worry about how UCLA will recreate itself and bring all the faculty and students too back into that collective that we had long ago. The other thing I want to emphasize today, I believe when you do numerical analysis, you're making a big mistake. You can do data analysis, but humans are best at processing visual information. That's number one, the visual display. Secondly, humans are good at understanding the story that underlies those visual displays. And last of all, the numbers. So when we teach econometrics or statistics, we get this all upside down. And we teach all the theorems about the numbers, but we don't teach them how to create stories that would explain to the audience what was in the data set. And we don't insist on them creating visual images that will help the audience understand or to help yourself understand what's really going on. So I'm going to illustrate a lot of pictures, and I want to have a conversation about them. So together we'll create knowledge. So the questions I'm going to answer, what's a recession? What are some precursors or predictors of recession? It's really about whether today is a few weeks away from recession. And finally, does it take a recession to control inflation? And then last, does a recession create investment opportunities for you? So I'm going to tell you about how you ought to organize your portfolio to deal with the uncertainties over the next decade. And I'll submit a bill to each of you at the end. Okay, so this is a picture of unemployment. And the horizontal axis goes from 1948 over to 2023. That's the period of time. And the vertical axis goes from 0 to 4 up to 14. That's the percentage of Americans who record themselves as being unemployed. And then that spike up, way at the, over there, way at the top, that's the COVID-19. And you can see it created an extreme level of unemployment like nothing we've ever seen before. Okay, so here's your first task, is look at this picture. There's a bunch of mountains. And in your mind's eye, color code the slopes that are facing in the westerly direction on the left and make them yellow. Can you do that? You got that all done? So if you didn't, I would help you out. But those are the official NBR recessions that are encoded in yellow. So what they've done is they identified the sharp rises in unemployment. So there's a sort of a tradition of saying that a recession is 2 quarters of negative growth. I think that misses the whole point. A recession is a market failure that allows or creates unwanted idleness, not just of labor, which is the unemployment, but unwanted idleness in factories, in office buildings, and apartments. It's a malady of the market system, and it's inconsistent with economics models, actually. Another thing that's of interest here is way to the right is a very low unemployment rate. The most recent one is very low. You see that? You have to go way back until 1968 to find a similarly low unemployment rate. So I ask you, your job is to forecast whether a recession is coming or not. Is a low unemployment rate a symptom of a recession to come? Or is it a high unemployment? And the fact that we had a very low unemployment rate coming in December, should we have worried or should we celebrate? And I'm asking you to answer that question by looking at this picture. Anybody want to tell me what they see? In other words, I'm asking you what's the unemployment like right next to those yellow bars that you created. Is it high or is it low? Is it high or is it low? Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you factor labor participation rate into this?
Oh, no, you're going to make me all confused because unemployment is a psychological problem. So what he's saying is that the surveys come to your home and you're sitting there drinking a margarita, watching TV, and the survey taker says, were you looking for a job last month? and you look up and say, does it look like I was looking for a job? Maybe you're not part of the labor force, you're not unemployed. Or you say, oh, sure, I was looking, then you're considered unemployed. But I don't think it's as inaccurate as I just suggested in that story. It is something that spikes up enormously. It's not attitudes are changing, but vast numbers of jobs are being lost at that time. But in general, I agree with the message you're trying to get across. But I hope what you see is the unemployment rate is high immediately after recession. It falls, high and it falls. So low unemployment is a symptom of a problem, not a solution. And we all see that? If you're going to predict it, you would predict it based on low. So I'm going to do that same analysis that you've just done using a different data set. And let me make a picture, see if you can get the message across. So we're going to look at these episodes that are 12 quarters, 8 quarters, 4 quarters before the recession. And this is the first one. This is the contribution of residential investment. It's about housing. I'm talking about how housing helps us predict the recession that's coming. That's the contribution of residential investment to GDP growth. That comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the GDP that we're talking about. And the GDP growth rate is typically 3%. So when the contribution is 1.5, that's way big compared to normal. It's making the GDP very strong. But as this is the 1957 Q3. That's 1957 Q3. One more beyond that was 57 Q4. That's when recession began. So you can see that you had strong residential investment, weaker, and kind of weaker over the end. That was one of those expansions. So in your mind's eye, in the previous picture, you didn't look at just one. You looked at a whole bunch of them to see what was happening at the end. You with me on this? So I'm going to add, that's 1969 Q4, the end of the 60s. Next comes 1973 Q4. That was in the Arthur Burns era when he was German. That's the Volcker ending in 1980 Q1. That's 1990 Q3. That's 2001. Here's 2007 Q4. Now you already all experienced this. This is in this one. This is 2007. This is 2006. This is 2005, and you can see that housing was very weak 2 years ahead of the recession. It wasn't just one. So now, with that summary, I'm going to add that's the averages. And now we're going to take the most recent data, and in order to form a forecast, we're going to insert the most recent data into this visual display. That's going to determine whether you're 1 month, 1 quarter, or 4 quarters away from the recession. So here's an example of the most recent data. Those triangles represent the 4 most recent data. I put those over there, and I put the same 4 numbers over here in squares. So you vote, which is it the triangles or the squares that fit the historical data best? Do you have an opinion? If the thing about trying to get as close to the means as you could get, the historical averages, is the triangles and squares. So these squares are way away from the means. But these are pretty close. But you are allowed to raise your hand and say, this, I think, is not completely correct, because this tracks very well 2 of these episodes. It doesn't track the other ones. So if you had a story that would explain why those 2 episodes are similar to this one, you could say, no, it's not a recession that's going to occur immediately, but it could be 2 years ahead. And you have an algorithm that puts us way to the right, meant to fit the data closest. And that's telling you that the housing sector is bringing out big alarm bells. Housing starts were down again, the last release. The last 4, 5, 6 months. It's very far down. That's a symptom of recessions. Typically, there's 2 job losses that contribute to the biggest problems of recession: construction and manufacturing. So another important indicator of recession is what's called an inverted yield curve. Here you have the bond yields, 1%, 2%, 6%, by month. So there's a 5-year treasury bond, a 10-year treasury bond, and you can see that there's what's called an upward sloping yield curve, meaning that if you commit your money to a 10-year bond, you're going to get a higher rate of return than if you went for the short-term investment. The reason is that that long-term bond has lots of risk associated with it. It could be inflation, it could be a failure to the debt service on the bond, and so the short bond is much more secure. But then there are these episodes like we're in right now, in which the yield curve is downward sloping. So it turns out that the inverted yield curve is a bond market prediction that a recession is going to come soon. And the reason is, you ask yourself, why would you buy a 10-year treasury that pays less than the 3-month treasury? Well, if you knew that 3-month was going to fall sometime soon as the recession comes, the Fed's going to cut that interest rate. You might have a good interest rate for a month or two, but it wouldn't last. So now would be the time to tie up your money in that 10-year bond so that when the Fed changes its mind and starts to lower the interest rate, it's not going to affect you. You're going to be in good shape. So this is really a bond market prediction. You can see this in this picture as well. This is the spread between the 10-year and the 3-month, and you can see the means are going down over to the right. Kind of interesting, it comes back up a little bit because the Fed at that point is saying, oh my God, I made a mistake. I got to lower my interest rates again, and that tends to make the slope of the yield curve a little bit steeper. But generally, an inverted yield curve, you can see in the Burns and Volcker era, especially, they create a very steep negative yield curve, and they create terrible recessions. So, and that's my algorithm, putting that in the most recent data. The problem here is that you had a couple of quarters with very high, very steep yield curves, followed by a couple of quarters not so steep. It makes it hard to put it in there. It makes it hard to know exactly what to forecast. But the fact that we're having this ongoing inverted yield curve is a prediction on the part of the bond market that a recession is going to come soon. So what about inflation? It's a scary topic. Here's what Jerome Powell said. One way or another, this was done in July 2021. One way or another, we're not going to be going into a period of high inflation for a long period of time because, of course, we have the tools to address that. Jerome Powell. And I say, really? And here he is trying to fix that car that he doesn't know what he's doing. So what's bad about unexpected inflation? It's hard on the value of bonds because you're being paid with dollars that are not as valuable as they were before. So it's unwinding these fixed contracts, unwinding fixed contracts in the labor market, unwinding fixed contracts, retirement contracts too, which aren't indexed to inflation. You can end up being worse off because everything is going up. It's becoming more expensive. And it's also important that it causes havoc for shoppers because it's very hard to find the best place to buy, to find the best price. And that's an important point. The usual inflation is supply and demand story, where supply is weakened because of COVID-19, or demand is accelerated because of the federal government is giving all these stimuli, and that's the cause of inflation. But what I want to tell is another story, which is it's a social disease. And it's a social disease in the following sense. If I run a restaurant in a non-inflationary environment and I decide to increase my price, I'm going to lose customers because they're going to go and see if they can get something cheaper. But in an inflationary period, I raise my price, everybody else is raising price, shoppers are not going to be able to have any impact on me anymore. And the more that we operate collectively, the restaurants, it's more like a cartel, and the restaurant's going to make monopoly-like profit in an environment. They're going to pass the additional cost for the groceries and for the workers on the customers, but they're going to pass more than that on the customers because of this inflation effect. So how are we going to stop that? Let me move on. How are we going to win? The win buttons never work, by the way. But I'm going to take a look at this period of time. This black line represents inflation going up and down. And the really serious inflation that we had back here, and that's a recent one. The most serious one was back in the 70s. So I've color-coded these inflation rates as green meaning low, red means hot and it's increasing, blue means cold, and decreasing, red and blue, red and blue. So we're going to look at another picture with red and blue. So don't forget, red means increasing inflation and blue meaning reduction of inflation. And we're going to look at that same data, except this time we're going to have the unemployment rate as a horizontal axis. And we're going to have the inflation rate as a vertical. And this curve is what's known as a Phillips curve. A theoretical or empirical finding, I guess, which is that if unemployment is lower, you're going to have higher inflation. That's what that curve says. And then the question is, what does the evidence say? That's a theoretical model. What's the evidence say? So let's start with that green data, where the inflation was pretty constant, but unemployment is going up and down a little bit. So there was no relationship between unemployment and inflation in the early 60s.
I'm not sure I understand.
Sorry, doesn't understand.
What was the question?
Somebody's phone was going.
Oh, okay, that's it. So now we're going to have the red part, where the inflation is going up. You can see that unemployment fell below 4, a little bit below 4, and boom, you get this incredible inflation. But then the Fed jumps in and creates a recession. The recession comes with higher unemployment, and then you get a reduction of inflation. So you didn't get any reduction in inflation until you created that recession. Here's the next red one. The thing that's interesting is that it looked like, here, it looked like you had a critical number around 3.5. Here you have a critical number of 5. As soon as you got down to 5, inflation is going sky high. So then comes this blue period where you spike up the unemployment rate, create a recession, and inflation goes down again. Oh, we got this under control. But then comes another red, and those black dots represent Volcker taking over the Federal Reserve. And he's in the midst of a very bad situation, extreme increases in inflation. And by the way, here it was a 6% that comes with the incredible inflation. It's like the economy is getting more and more diseased, more and more critical. So Volcker says, I'm going to stop this. And he jumps up the interest rates enormously, creates an inverted yield curve, and that's what dropped the inflation down to historical level. You look at all the data, there's never been a case where inflation was controlled without having a recession. So the issue is that's what's going to happen next. And it's still an ongoing discussion. It could be somehow we'll be able to sneak through this without it, but that would require inflation to go down significantly without a recession. So this is the inflation data, the most recent inflation data over the last several years, and you can see the inflation is getting a little less. So that could make us optimistic. I was optimistic until the last two numbers came up and they got a little bit higher, and I think, well, this is not working. So the Fed has a difficult task ahead, whether to wait it out and see whether the inflation is going to cure itself, because it's a different kind of inflation, or say, damn it, we got to create an unemployment in order to get this under control. So there's really two alternatives. You need a recession to rid the economy of inflation disease, or this time inflation is different. It's a COVID-19 related phenomenon that is now going to be cured. It's not a monetary problem. And that guy didn't know about the alternative. So then this is my last slide on this segment. And this is the investment advice. So this is the real Standard & Poor's index. Standard & Poor's index divided by the inflation rate. And what you should see, well, the vertical scale is logarithmic. So the distance between 1 and 200 is bigger than the distance between 2 and 300. So it squeezes the top at the top. And squeezing that, it turns constant rates of growth into straight lines. And the reason that's good is you can see the straight line. So I've drawn 3 straight lines in this image. And you can see that there was a period oops. Anyway, this goes from 1950 to 2000. And that's the a good economic growth. The Standard & Poor's was growing at 5.1% per year in real terms. But then, oh my God, here comes that inflation period in the 70s, and the S&P went down significantly at the rate of 5.8%, and then it comes back up. And understand that if you had bought the S&P in 1970, you wouldn't be back to where you were until 1990. 20 years with no improvement in your portfolio. So to me, I don't know whether we're going to repeat the 70s, but I worry that the Fed's going to have problems controlling inflation. And if it starts to create unemployment, that's going to be what they call stagflation, and it's going to be real tough on the equities markets. So you need to have either cash or bonds in your portfolio that can be deployed when that crash occurs. You can see the crash of the V's are all indicated. Every one of these economic downturns has a V associated with it, where the V drops and it comes back. The reason it drops is because people get scared, they don't want to buy. They don't see the second half of the V, they only think about the first slope. The second half of the V creates a buying opportunity for you, if you can get the timing right. So the ideal thing would be to have cash. I don't mean a whole lot, but I mean enough so that you feel like you're going to be able to win the outcome in the event that there's a severe recession. So the V's create investment opportunities, and the decline in the 70s is a very worrisome thing. When you think about it, it could be going another 2 decades in which there wasn't any real increase in equities. Thanks for listening, if you did. I'll get questions.
Do my hat trick again. And now we're going to open it up for questions. I see a hand over here.
Yeah, during the Reagan years, starting in 82, let's say, the inflation, when he took office, was 13.5%.
My hearing isn't very good, so you got to help me out.
Okay. He's saying during the early Reagan period, the inflation rate got up to something like 13%.
When he took office.
The
And it was
CPI.
at, I think, 6.
You're talking about, in that image that I just showed you, the Volcker era had inflation at 12% in the early 1980, just before the recession in 1980. That's true.
And when Reagan left, it was, I think, either 9 or 6, I forgot which. But there was no recession during Reagan yet. Inflation dropped.
Yeah, but that was the Volcker era, where he created inverted yield curve. He grabs all the interest rates, the short-term interest rates, and he pushes them sky high. So you have a short-term rate that's almost 2 percentage points, so-called 200 basis points above the short-term rate. And that means that the banking sector doesn't make intermediation profits. Normally, the healthy banking sector will take deposits at low rates and make loans at different maturities at higher rates. And they make what's called intermediation profits. The banking sector, and you take away those intermediation profits, and the banking sector has to be much more careful in lending. So what you get is elevated lending standards, and typically when this expansion is nearing its end, you've been dipping into the bottom of the barrel of home buyers to get people who really shouldn't get the loans that are very risky. So when you have an elevated lending standards, that just kills off the housing market, and boom, you have a big crash.
I got the second half. Unemployment also dropped during Reagan too.
That's, well,
Even though we had,
no, I think it definitely dropped. It got back to normal. You know, the Fed's normal was like 2 or 3%. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm much too young to remember any of all that stuff. But has there ever been previously an experience where there was a kind of funny money that the federal government gave out, the incentives for people to do nothing during the COVID time and spend that money?
No, there's never been a president who gave away money to help out student loans either.
Exactly so.
Same category.
Since Chris pointed out, you can't do the experiment. Where are you making your prediction?
Well, that's what I said. That one slide is saying, it could be this time is different. And if it's different, then those programs are edging out. Many of them are gone completely. And by the time they're gone, then you ought to be back to normal inflation.
So it's a crapshoot. Is it different or isn't it?
50-50 is my crap.
I should say that if you looked at the most recent UCLA forecast, the December forecast, instead of coming up with one set of numbers, they actually came up with two. There was a recession scenario and a not recession, but kind of sluggish scenario. And they didn't really say which one was going to be the outcome. That was sort of a departure. I don't know if that was one of Ed's contributions.
This has been my belief all the time, because these forecasters never predict a recession. Economists have never predicted a recession, except this one, where everybody's on TV all the time talking about recession is imminent. So if you really believe in the accuracy of the economists, when they say there's not going to be a recession, then they're accurate in the sense there will be. And when they say the recession really coming, then it's not going to be. But I think that that you ought to be identifying the two outcomes that are distinctly different in terms of how you ought to run your portfolio, how you ought to run your business. You have to know that there's a risk of recession and be prepared for that. The higher the risk, the more preparation that you should be engaged in.
Let me ask one question that I think you raised implicitly in response to the question over here too. So we had a very funny recession, that very last point on the slide where the unemployment rate gets up to 16%. In effect, the government said, close your restaurant, close your movie theater, don't go to a hotel, don't fly in an airplane. We closed whole sectors of the economy by sort of fiat. And then it wasn't some internally generated thing within the economy if there had been no COVID at all. So does the fact that we had a very odd recession, sort of a recession by fiat, change our estimates of how we come out of that and what's going to happen afterwards?
Well, I wouldn't call it a recession. I know the NBR would call it a recession, but nothing was receding. You shut everything down. And that's what caused a decline in jobs and a cause and decline in sales. So it creates a whole new set of data. That's the problem with data analysis, is that data is only good to the extent that it's repeating itself. And this is something entirely new, and you're forced into making guesses as to how this stuff is going to unwind. It's very hard to do. And I think if you look at the unemployment rate, it looks like we went from 12-13% unemployment. You had incredible growth in the economy. If that was the normal thing, you'd have a surge of GDP, and you're just getting back to normal as you get back there. So I would not call it a recession.
And so what I think probably maybe the bottom line for you is that since we're in a sort of a very unpredictable period where even the forecast is giving you two different scenarios, it's your job in managing your portfolios and so on to just think about the higher level of risk that you're facing given all the uncertainty that we've described.
Well, I'd like to talk with the Federal Reserve about that. I think that they should sit still for a while and not increase interest rates anymore, and let's see what happens over 6 months or a year, rather than thinking that you know what you're doing. You've raised the interest rates enormously already, and let's let that thing work its way through the economy rather than pushing it even farther.
Okay, well, I think we're ready for our second segment, and I think Ed is going to be, we were talking about sort of very short-term kind of up and down business cycles. I think Ed wants to talk a little bit about some of the other perspectives that we might have about the economy, maybe sort of longer range issues. So I'm going to turn it back to him, and he'll introduce part two.
So just so you know, when I'm saying the economy is more dangerous than climate change. And I'm trying to get that across now. I'll try to do this quickly because we're already 45 minutes into this thing. So this second set of questions is, how long have Homo sapiens been on this earth? What part of that human presence was affected by industrialization? We had a very brief period of industrialization when you had a successful outcome. We are now in the post-industrial age, that's what I'm saying. And it's totally different. It has lots of problems associated with it. And what did industrial revolution, how did it affect per capita incomes and total population? What's the economic difference between machinery of the industrial age and personal computers of the post-industrial age? Totally different kind of equipment that's being used by humans in the industrial age versus the post-industrial age. And I really believe that every educational institution ought to plan for the realities of this post-industrial world and realize that the mundane intellectual tasks are all going to be done by computers. So you need these kids to be creative, analytical problem solvers, and not just memory machines. So we ought to get rid of all the memory machines that are going on campuses. And then this post-industrial world is going to have extreme income inequality. And we need to decide collectively what we're going to do about that inequality. So let's go back. This is, tells you how old the Earth was. The Earth was formed 4,600 million years ago, 4.6 billion years. Quite a long time ago. The first life appeared 3.8 billion years ago. The first land vertebrates were 250 million years ago. And what about humans? Only 130,000 years. So we've been on in this experiment called the Earth a tiny fraction of the time. And we need to treat ourselves with some humility and understanding about what role we're creating or causing, the problems that we're causing for the Earth. And then here's another slide that shows you from 10,000 years ago up till now, the things that were happening among the folks that lived here. You can see you move over to the right, you get organized agriculture, domestication, pyramids. At the far right, you see the printing press. And right after the printing press, you see industrialization. And the reason that occurs is that your good ideas, once you had Gutenberg's printing press, could be printed inside a book, and that could be distributed throughout the world. You didn't have to have only face-to-face communication. The internet is way better than that, because the ideas that you have today, you can type on the internet and boom, they're around the whole world. That should create more rapid industrial, more rapid innovations. But continuing that, Thomas Malthus is famous for talking about what we call the Malthusian traps, where when you have some technological improvements, that stimulates more population growth. And the more population growth gets to the point where you have disease, famine, war, and calamity. So population growth is always limiting the economic progress. It was the wealthy, the elite, would benefit from the technological improvement, but the poor people, were per capita incomes were not moved at all. And that's how economics became the dismal science, because of what Malthus was saying. So let's see what he has to say. Here's global per capita income, starting at 1300 AD, going over to 2000. And you can see where Malthus was in control, that there was no increase in per capita incomes from 1300 up to around 1800. There were technological improvements, but they didn't increase per capita incomes because that was offset by the Malthusian force. But with the technological improvements of the industrial age, that outran the Malthusian attack on per capita incomes, and we were able to improve per capita incomes dramatically. There's a new book by Brad DeLong from Berkeley that refers to 1870 as a critical point. What about population? So again, this is the log scale There's millions of people, 1, 10, and 10 and 20. The distance between 10 and 20 is the same as 10 and 1. That's the log scale. So you're supposed to see straight lines. I'm going to help you see one. Oh, that's the scale. And there's one, 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. There was a surge of population. You see that? But then after, the 1,000 years afterwards was in the Dark Ages, and there was hardly any improvement or any gain in population. But then, with the industrialization, it just skyrockets. It's projected to be 10 billion. It's 8 billion now. It's projected to be 10 billion by the year 2100. And so, but that didn't create the offsetting Malthusian force of killing humans. But it did kill all kinds of animals. We're having extinctions of all different types because of the excess crowding of the earth as a consequence of that population explosion. And then there's something another thing that's very important is for our democracy, we need to create a middle class. And we built the middle class and our democracy in the factories of America. And now we have hardly any factories left, and the democracy is under attack. And it's not going to go away because the manufacturing jobs are not coming back. There's going to be a few jobs for high school graduates, but not really very many. So this is the construction jobs, this is a fraction of jobs. So construction jobs are pretty well paying. Leisure and hospitality has been growing, but not that well paid. And education and healthcare has a mixture of jobs. But this is manufacturing. So we used to have 30% of our workforce in manufacturing, and now we're down about 8%. By the way, that's another reason why the recession is going to be a lot weaker, because usually there's a lot of manufacturing jobs lost in a recession, but manufacturing doesn't matter very much. It's not that big anymore. So that changes the nature of recessions. But the important thing is the high-wage manufacturing jobs have, to a large extent, disappeared. And our high school graduates, particularly in the Midwest, where all these jobs left, they're just angry about their situation. They don't see anything that can improve it. So another thing that I think is interesting is there's always labor productivity. This is output per hour. Again, it's a log scale. And labor productivity is growing throughout the second half of the 20th century. So if people are more productive, doesn't that kill off jobs? If they're more productive, doesn't it kill off jobs? That's true, unless you have innovations and new products. So in the first half of the 20th century, there was incredible innovations. You think about what the 1900 house was like versus the 1950 house. The 1950 house was full of all kinds of equipment, and none of that was available. So although there's productivity improvement, that was offset by innovations in products, new products. That's gone now. You know, you have a new cell phone, that doesn't create jobs. It's just building that, it's the same kind of process as it was before. And then in the midst of all this, we have the ratio of CEO to average worker pay, which back in the 60s, the 60s were our period of extraordinary economic growth, income levels at every point of the income distribution rising dramatically. But then that's when the ratio of pay was about 40 to 1, and now it's like 400 to 1. Incredible jump up in CEO pay. We're going to come back to this in a minute. So I grew up in outside of Binghamton, New York, across from these two towns, Endicott and Johnson City. What you see in front of you is the Thomas J. Watson on the right, who created IBM. IBM had their original facilities all in that same town. And the other one is Henry Endicott, who created the Endicott-Johnson Shoe Company. And this Johnson was a big believer in taking care of the neighborhood. He built parks, he built carousels, he built homes, he gave the workers health care. And his view was, his job was not to maximize income, not to make the investors wealthy, but to make the communities really well off. And then he convinced Watson that Watson should have the same attitude. that he should facilitate the home lives of the people who lived in that area. And he definitely did. Between them, they created this really happy middle-class area where people were pretty well off, but you didn't have the extreme incomes there. You had good incomes, but not anything else. And then I worked for IBM. We didn't get to that point. When I graduated from high school, I got hired by IBM, and they put me into a programming class with college graduates. And coding doesn't take a college graduate. It's a natural skill. I was really pretty good at that. But on my desk, they had that think statement. Think was everywhere. So it's really the first evidence of a post-industrial world where it's not how strong you are that matters, it's how well you think. Thomas J. Watson was emphasizing, think, think, think. That's what makes IBM great. The first of our post-industrial organizations. So then I ask you this rhetorical question. Is a personal computer like a forklift or like a microphone? So what do I mean by that? A forklift, once we learn how to drive it, everybody in this room is equally strong. If each of us has a microphone and we can sing, and we can sing to the whole globe, there might be a couple people here who could sing, but most of us, certainly myself, I would be left out. So the point about the microphone is it improves the productivity of a very small set of people, the people who have the natural talent, and increases the value of that talent immensely. Or another way of saying it, on the left, that's Detroit. On the right, that's Hollywood. Hollywood has enormous income inequality. You have these stars who are making huge amounts of money, and everybody else is working in restaurants hoping that someday they become a star. And my concern is we're moving into a Hollywood type of era in which the few people, talent, natural talent, used to be in the Victorian age, would spread wealth from between generations through land. You make sure that your children own the land that you own. Now the most important thing is the natural skills that allow them to do the tech work and to create value using the computer. And then we need an educational system that focuses on that. Recognizes the importance of problem solving and creativity. So I'm getting ready to wrap this up. Examples of community abuse. Moving manufacturing jobs to China has really killed off our middle class around all those middle western communities. And then I heard this in Joe Biden's speech, which is sky-high prices for insulin. And then what about the debt load? He didn't mention this, but we're putting a huge debt load on the children of America. You and I aren't paying the taxes for that. But it can't be avoided. There's going to be a huge amount of interest payments that are going to be made in the future. Not much left is for anything else. And then charging sky-high prices for education. That's a community abuse. I'm telling you, I've been overpaid for a long time. Oh, that's my comment about myself. So what we need is a much more community focus. And rather than respect for material well-being, we should respect the people who are making our communities better off. And we ought to, if not overtly, ought to bring back the spirits of Thomas Watson and George Johnson, where the workers are part of the family. They're not just pieces of equipment that you can hire and fire. They're part of your family, and you ought to be making sure that their lives are in good shape. So take a breath. Thanks again for listening, if you did.
Okay, so that's our long-run perspective. Go ahead.
You talked about Watson and Johnson and their theory about improving the community. Can you give me an example of a corporation or a couple that are doing that right now?
can do that. And the thing is, to me, the problem is finance is taking over the business sector. And the emphasis is all on maximizing value to shareholders. You know, Milton Friedman taught economists that that's what you should be doing. And we've lost track of this other role of making warm and happy communities for all the workers involved. And I don't know any corporations that do that. Yeah.
Do you know the proportion of, say, first-class citizens and the lower-class citizens at this point, as opposed to the middle-class number? It seems like we have much larger upper class, much larger lower class, and very little middle class.
Well, it's hard to define these categories, but I think that the upper class takes a lot of income. You know, some of these people are making millions of dollars, so maybe $10 million would be upper class, and the middle class would be from 10 to $500,000 maybe, I don't know. There aren't too many people in there. And if you don't make too much money, if you make a family only $100,000, it's going to be pretty hard to live in Los Angeles. But I don't know the exact categories. It's a vague use of the word. But really what I mean is by it's a sense of utopia. That's that book by Brad DeLong, which the title was Just Slouching Toward Utopia. And his argument is these political systems promise that they will get you to utopia, and you should support them, whether it's communist, fascist, or democracy. And so what does utopia mean? It doesn't mean everybody has the same income. It's everybody's happy with the income distribution. And right now we have a middle America who are angry as hell over about that income distribution.
There's a hand way in the back.
Yes, how do you see the Amazon business model affecting our future economic environment?
You're testing my hearing.
Yeah, how do you see the Amazon business model affecting our future?
I'm afraid I can't talk about that. And I can't tell you why either. Go ahead.
Has anybody studied two things? The impact of the Great Society on the overall economy and the impact of the material deregulation in the Trump administration. I mean, Trump took office, he repealed 15 regs and dramatically rolled back regulations and the place he took off like a rocket ship with no Fed, no dramatic spending, just deregulation that seemed to hit the entrepreneur. So that's a very short little data, but the Great Society has put a significant part of this economy in the dumpster for a long time, and why not so long ago. Any thoughts on that?
There's so many levers that can be pulled. We need to have a long discussion about all this stuff, right?
Has anyone ever tried to regress that?
Say it again.
Regress the Great Society program implementation, economic impact on specific.
Regressive.
Yeah.
You're talking about econometrics?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know.
I think it's too many variables. Way too many variables.
You noted, of course, the huge deficit that we have now, $30 trillion. And what do you see as the end game?
Well, you say 30 trillion, but there's $100 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities from Medicare.
The amount the government owes will never, one can't think of a way to be paid off. So what do you see happening? Where do you see it happening?
Well, I'm telling you, Medicare and Social Security have to be controlled because they're both underfunded. There's going to be a time when they're either going to cut those things somehow or going to raise taxes dramatically. But my view is that each year that goes by and we're doing that borrowing and not paying for the services provided by the government ourselves, we're doing a disservice. That's a community abuse, not our community, but the future community, the children and our grandchildren. We're going to have to pay the heavy debt load. And so I think we can move in the right direction. I'm not Republican, so don't start thinking.
But what that's a logical thing to do.
Yeah.
But if you look at just yesterday's LA Times, the headlines have to do with, they're after your social security, they want to cut it. And whenever we get into some kind of a rational discussion of managing that debt, it becomes a political football, and people then shy away because they want to get reelected. So what do you see as, now we'd like to happen, but what do you see as actually will happen?
I'm trying to remember the name of Reagan's advisor. I'll tell you what the advisor told Reagan. He says the problem that you Republicans have is the Democrats are the Santa Claus party. They're giving out presents. And the Republicans are the Scrooge party because they just say balance the budget, balance the budget. And so Reagan says, what should we do about that? He says, you've got to give presents too. And Reagan said, what? He said, cut taxes. That's it. So from then on, the Republicans cut taxes and the Democrats raised expending. And nobody gave a damn about the deficit. The deficit started to rise under Reagan. And they've gotten worse and worse and worse. So I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. Republicans are doing it in a way which is highly misleading and inappropriate, in my opinion, by not bringing this up when they had that huge reduction in taxes for corporations during the Trump era. So I don't know. It's a mess we're in. The country's in a mess. Choose another planet.
Another question, you talked about, community abuse, things going on. One was the high cost of education.
Yeah.
And then you have the Biden administration, for giving student loans.
Yeah.
Are those congruent or not, or does that come under the
Well, the ones